Hello, Deputy Prime Minister. It is wonderful to have you here today. Thanks for making the time to speak with our audience at Toronto Life. I want to begin by asking you how you are doing. This has been, probably the leadership challenge of your life. You also have 3 kids at home whose lives were interrupted like everybody else's lives. I understand your eldest daughter was off in college for her first year and had to end that. And I'm wondering how you're holding up and how you've been managing.
Okay, so first of all, let me say, hi, Sarah. It is great to see you. And hi, all Toronto Life watchers and readers. I am a Toronto Life reader myself, and it's great to be here with you all. So, Sarah, I get asked this question of how I am doing a lot. And I will tell you how I always answer and what I really think right away in my heart when I am asked it, which is actually, I am totally fine. And the people who I worry about and who I think we collectively should be worried about are, first of all the frontline workers, frontline healthcare workers, frontline workers in long-term care facilities, frontline workers, temporary foreign workers who are working in our greenhouses right now, picking the fruits and vegetables we're going to go buy in the grocery store this afternoon. So that's category 1, I think we should be worried about. Category 2 is all the people who have lost their jobs. Millions of Canadians have lost their jobs, and that is a terrible thing. And category 3 is all the people who have lost or are really worried about losing their businesses. I'm thinking especially about, small business owners. Imagine you're someone who's running a family business that maybe your grandparents started, maybe it's a local neighborhood restaurant, and you're worried about whether you're going to be able to keep it going. So those are the people I worry about. And I will say sometimes the aforementioned children, they do sometimes complain about life, as do all humans. And I say to them what I've just said to you. They sometimes don't really appreciate that. And they say, well, yeah, but, we have our problems too. I get that. But when it comes to me personally, I am just so mindful that my life is completely fine, especially compared to that of a lot of Canadians. But thank you for asking.
I hear you. What are your coping mechanisms for managing through this challenging time? Are you binge watching Netflix like the rest of us? Are you playing a lot of board games? Has there been more backyard barbecuing than usual? What are you doing personally to get through?
So, Sarah, I would say at a very personal level, just in terms of my daily life, I have had a really different experience from a lot of people in this crisis. This has been a time that a lot of people I have, and my friends have sort of talked about being shut up at home with their families and driven crazy by that, and also maybe enjoying it and the board games and the Netflix and stuff. For me, actually, it's been a time that I've worked harder maybe than I ever have in my life, and maybe a time when I haven't seen my family as much as I would like to. So it's been a different experience. And sort of coping mechanisms, I try to run 4 times a week. I am a big believer in that.
Where in Toronto do you like to run?
I have 2 favorite runs. One, and then I have Ottawa favorite run. My Toronto favorite runs are in the Toronto Ravines. I go from my house, which is in Summerhill, down to the ravines, sort of towards the brickworks, and then you can turn right on that path and go up Milkman's Lane and go home. So that's one. And what I like about that is it's downhill for the first half. Then there is a terrible, terrible steep uphill. And I have to say, people are so nice, or maybe I just look like I'm dying as I'm going up the hill. But generally someone will say, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. So I find that encouraging. So that's one of my runs. And then the other one that I like is through the ravines in the other direction, going west from my house towards, just below Winston Churchill Park. and then through the Nordheimer Ravine, then the Spadina Stairs, and then I go up and down the Spadina Stairs only 3 times. Also, you get encouragement from passers-by there, and then home. So those are my 2 favorite Toronto ones. And if I'm in Ottawa, more boringly, I just like run along the Rideau Canal. But you can see wildlife on the Rideau Canal.
I imagine that before the pandemic, much of your life was spent on airplanes. You were in Africa and Tokyo, and I suspect you're doing a lot less of that now. And I'm wondering how that has changed your outlook on life.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, Sarah. And it is true. I used to fly a very great deal, and I haven't been on an airplane since March. So what it has meant is I spend more time in a car.
Right. I'm dying to ask what you make of this sort of global consensus that female leaders are doing a better job at flattening the curve and managing the pandemic and bringing their economies back. I bristle a bit at the question because it has some gender essentialist assumptions. I suspect you have thoughts about that, and I'd love to hear them.
So I have been asked the question by many people. And maybe I will start by saying there are some women leaders in the world right now who I think about a lot and who I think we can all learn from. Angela Merkel is someone I have admired for a very long time, and she's doing just an outstanding job. And I think she is an example of leadership in general, but also actually why having a really good, strong education can be really useful in a leader. You know, she has a PhD, a STEM PhD, and that has really helped her. So Angela Merkel, one woman leader I'm a real fan of. And by the way, this STEM point I make, I do use with my children to encourage the doing of homework. Jacinda Ardern, I think, really impressive. And I find her decisiveness and also her sort of very powerful empathy, I think, have been incredibly important. And we, I think, as a world saw those after the terrible Christchurch shooting. And I think that is one of the qualities that has helped her lead New Zealand so effectively. And here in Canada, what's not to love about Bonnie Henry? Truly terrific, and also excellent shoes. But to that kind of core question, you know, like you, I bristle a little bit. And, you know, I've had people sort of in a flattering way make this point with me and sort of be like, yeah, see, doesn't it show, you know, women rock? This is a great time for women leaders. And like, by the way, I'm a woman too, right? So there's sort of a complementary angle to it. I think that we as women need to be quite careful about blanket assertions like that, because I really fear that as soon as you start to claim that there is something about being a woman, whether it is the female experience or whether, you know, someone thinks it's genetic, you know, whatever, some way that women are that makes them particularly suited to lead in situation A, someone is going to say, well, yeah, fine, those were great qualities for situation A, but now we're in situation B, and the ladies are really not so great to have in charge in this particular time. So I am always pretty cautious about those kinds of blanket assertions. But what I would say, you know, to take the examples of the 3 women leaders who I consider to be real role models and heroes that I've cited, Angela Merkel, I think her comfort with technical detail, her extreme level of preparation. She is the ultimate person who does her homework. And I'll give you a personal example. I've, you know, been in a few meetings with her, and I think it would be fair to say, you know, I know her a little bit. She knows who I am. And she told me a thing I found just astonishing, which is after meeting President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, or before meeting him to prepare for it, she watched not just one, but several episodes of the TV show he made as a comedian. Think about that. She's the Chancellor of Germany, and she does that much of a deep background preparation on this guy. So I would say Angela Merkel, tremendous technical expertise, not afraid of the detail, a careful, thoughtful decision maker, and willing to do bold things as well. You know, what she has done with the Eurozone together with Macron, people were surprised she took that bold move. So that's one great leadership example. Jacinda Ardern, I would say, real compassionate leadership and also decisive. And I guess about Bonnie Henry, I would say those two things too. I think she has shown real compassion, and her kind of injunction to the people of BC, but I think all of Canada has been listening, saying, be kind. I say that to myself 100 times a day, and that includes we need to be kind to ourselves. And also Bonnie Henry has been prepared to take tough decisions really fast. Like she did it with long-term care facilities in BC. That made a tremendous difference. She did it with prisons in BC. So I would say let's focus on what are the leadership skills and qualities. And maybe I'll say one other thing from those three women, is humility. And I think humility is a good quality in people in general. It is especially a good quality in leaders because the more important a leader you are, the more occasion you have not to be humble. And it is maybe a particularly valuable quality in the face of something so monumental as a global pandemic. And to start from a place of humility, of actually, there's so much that we don't know. And to start from a place of assuming you're not going to get everything right. You are going to make mistakes, and you just have to do the best you can do. I think that's a good place to start too.
You mentioned educational background and research. You, of course, are a former journalist, and I'm wondering how that journalistic lens that you were so deeply enmeshed in informs how you work as a politician.
So that is something I've thought about a lot. And, those of us who have a career before going into politics, we just bring the skills and the way of working we learned in that first career to politics. And for sure, having been a journalist and also an editor really shapes how I approach my job. And I would say, first of all, good reporters do their own reporting. They rely on primary sources, and when they're trying to understand something, they go to the smartest person they can find directly and talk to that person. And I'm not saying that's the only way to do stuff, and it's quite different from the kind of standard operating manual for political leaders, which tends to be, you get your briefing, which has kind of percolated through many layers of people. And of course, I get those briefings and I'm grateful for them. But I also like to have my own direct conversations directly with people, partly because reporting is hard. And if you get a report of a conversation someone had, again, filtered through a couple of different people, you maybe only get 75% of what was actually said. I mean, from your own experience as an editor and as a cub reporter, it's hard to accurately write down what someone told you. So that is something that I just always find the time to do. In this crisis, a couple of examples of people I have leaned on would be Toronto's own David Fisman, a totally brilliant person and really dedicated and committed. And I talk to David pretty often just to get his sense of what's going on. Another great person is Sir John Bell, who is Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford. And guess what? He's a Rhodes Scholar from Edmonton. And he is one of the people leading the Oxford vaccine effort. And he's someone I've spoken to recently, and I found that to be a great conversation. Another person, it just happens that the person who is currently the head of the Gates Foundation was a baby reporter with me and my husband at the Financial Times back when we were young. Young, how nice that was to be. And his name is Mark Sussman. And I've found talking to Mark to be really useful because obviously the Gates Foundation has this tremendous international perspective, and that is useful to bring to bear on the situation too. And then maybe the final thing I would say that is just a characteristic of me because of how my life worked out is I tend to look at everything that is happening in Canada in an international perspective, whether it is what is happening with the coronavirus or what is happening with our economic response to the coronavirus. And I do, at least for me, that is really useful because this is a global pandemic. Other countries have, started, I was going to say their adventures in coronavirus, but that sounds too flip for something which is killing people, have started their ordeal with the coronavirus long before we have. And so just kind of keeping that in mind, I occasionally do calls. David Fisman very kindly organized a call of international epidemiologists, from places like South Korea, New Zealand, to just get a global sense. I do some calls with international economists. So that would be, I guess, my reporters set of kind of habits and instincts. And the second thing I would say from journalism, and I think we journalists, I hope you don't mind if I still call myself kind of a journalist in my heart, we journalists can sometimes underrate how hard it is to be a journalist. And that, reporting and being able to accurately report, that's a thing journalists have to do. Most people can't do it. So that's the primary sources part. Another quality that a good journalist and a good editor has to have is the ability to focus on the really important story of the moment and the ability to differentiate between the super important story and everything else. And when news breaks, if you're a good journalist or a good editor, you have to have the psychic ability to say, you know what, all this other stuff I was working on for the past 5 years, I have to push that to the other side of my desk and focus on this big story. You're nodding your head because every editor, every reporter, that it can be painful, right? You can be like 90% done this one thing. I'm sure you've had covers that you had to pull because something big happened, right? You're nodding, it's true, it happens. And I think the coronavirus has posed that kind of challenge to every person, every company, and certainly every country and national government in the world. You've had to be able to take a deep breath, say, that was then, this is now. This is quite literally, deathly peril. This is the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. We have to be relentless in our focus on this.
And I know Toronto Life audiences are curious about a few big picture questions about the state of Canada and how we move forward over the next few months and years. And the question that that keeps me up at night has to do with the American border. So every day I wake up and I see the number of cases coming out of Texas and California and Florida, and it really worries me. And I wonder how we as a nation navigate that, the border question, how Canadians should be thinking about our Americans to the south, and how we take the next steps during this crisis.
That is a great question, Sarah. And I would have to say, when I am just, walking around, going grocery shopping with a mask, which we should all be wearing now when we are indoors, getting asked questions by my neighbors, that is probably the question that I get asked most frequently, especially recently. And I would say a few things. First and most importantly, Canadians should feel very reassured to know that Canada's borders are controlled by us, by Canadians. We make all the decisions about our borders ourselves. And from the point of view of the federal government, and borders obviously are a federal responsibility, nothing is more important than the health and safety of Canadians. Having said that, with the Canada-US border, I actually think there's an extra reason to feel a little bit of reassurance in what is admittedly a very worrying time, which is that since March, we have had in place unprecedented restrictions on travel between Canada and the United States. Non-essential travel today is not permitted between Canada and the United States. And there are two sort of aspects of that ban that make it, I think, particularly effective and potentially enduring. And those are, first of all, that it has been reciprocal and mutually agreed with the United States. And I think that's a good thing. We have the world's longest unmilitarized border with the US, and I think being able to manage that border in a collaborative way is what mature adult countries do. And so far, knock on wood, we've managed to do that. The second thing, and this is something, to be honest, that I was really worried about when we put these measures in place at the beginning, we understood that, this is a big deal to restrict travel between Canada and the US, and for Canada to actually be seeking that. But we understood that there was some essential travel that we couldn't stop. That there is, trucks going across the border that bring food to our grocery stores every single day. Essential travel for our industries, for example, the automotive sector. Essential travel for our medical supply chain, which I think we all appreciate its importance today more than ever. So the trick was to stop the non-essential travel, but to keep the essential travel going. And kind of miraculously, and I think because of goodwill on both sides and the basic sensibleness of Canadians, we've managed to have that happen. The essential trade is still happening, but non-essential travel is restricted. And I do want to say, because you've expressed concerns, and that is 99.99% what I hear too. But I also hear from some people who say, you know what, it's a real hassle in my life that non-essential travel between Canada and the US is not possible right now. And to all of those Canadians, and there are, some, I just want to say, I am sorry. I know that this is a hassle, but so many of us have made huge sacrifices to fight the coronavirus. And first and foremost, we have to keep ourselves safe. And if it means, you can't go to your friend's wedding in the US this summer, I am sorry, I really am. Those are sacrifices. But at the end of the day, keeping our country safe and healthy is more important.
So perhaps my other source of great anxiety, and really I do have a long list I could share with you, has to do with the City of Toronto. Of course, at Toronto Life, we're greatly concerned about what's going to happen with the municipal budget. John Tory has already articulated out loud that he's worried we'll have to close libraries or shut subway lines. We, of course, have to balance our budget, and the revenue we've lost on the TTC from riders not using the TTC much is colossal, and the city is in a real pickle. I know that the federal government has a lineup, as long as the country, of people looking for support to manage through this crisis. But I am, of course, very biased and feel Toronto ought to be front of the line. How do you imagine the federal government will support Toronto through this time?
So look, I am the Member of Parliament for University Rosedale. And John Tory is not only my mayor, he is my constituent. So I am really aware of the issues that Toronto is facing, but not only Toronto, all of Canada's municipalities. It's complicated because municipalities are a provincial jurisdiction. And in ordinary times, the federal government can get into a lot of trouble with the provinces if we try to spend money with the cities. They can be quite jealous of that suzerainty. These, of course, are not ordinary times. And I think all of us recognize, or overwhelming majority of people in the country recognize, that in really important ways, municipalities are on the front line of the fight against coronavirus. So I really believe they need to be supported. I also believe the provinces need to step up too. And if we can get the federal government and the provinces to both chip in some money, that will support the municipalities even more. Now, the good news is we are in the midst of negotiating something that we are calling the Safe Restart Agreement, where the federal government is offering $14 billion to the provinces. That includes a considerable chunk of money to go to the municipalities. And part of what we're talking about with the premiers of provinces and territories right now is how much, specifically when it comes to the municipalities, will the provinces chip in as well?
I'm going to ask you two more questions and then I'm going to let you go. But these don't fall into the category of anxieties, but rather of moral or spiritual burdens. I think.
Oh no, spiritual burdens. That's not really like a political thing,
I think they intersect. So we have, as a country, the weaknesses in our system of supporting vulnerable people have been exposed in the course of the coronavirus. The two that weigh heavily on our shoulders as a society is the long-term care facilities, where our elderly people have had a totally traumatizing experience, and exposing systemic problems in long-term care. And of course, our migrant farm workers, who we are so dependent on in this country, and who are very vulnerable and exposed during this time. And I'm wondering if you can comment on what we've learned as a country on both those fronts and what we'll do better in the future.
That is a moral and spiritual question, and it is also a political one. And it's really interesting, Sarah, because it dovetails with a kind of theory I have about the coronavirus, which is that one way of looking at it is you can kind of step back and see it, in almost biblical terms, that with a kind of cruel implacability, the coronavirus has exposed in Canada and around the world the strengths and the weaknesses of every society and of every country. It has shown which countries have an effective government and which countries do not. It has shown which countries have a society that still believes in being a society and is able to kind of hang together, make sacrifices. Fighting it is about each one of us making a sacrifice for the common good. It's shown which societies are able to do that, which aren't. And I think, with this real cruel clarity, it has revealed who is neglected and who is not in every society around the world. And I think you're entirely right. what it has shown Canadians is we neglect our elders to, for me, a heartbreaking and horrifying degree. And it has shown that we maltreat our temporary foreign workers, especially, but not only, those working in agriculture. I think both are a national shame. I really hope and believe that we're going to learn that lesson and fix these terrible, terrible lacuna that have been revealed. And I do want to say one other thing to kind of conclude on a more optimistic note, which is some of the areas that we might have thought were our real weak points, at least so far have been places where we've risen to the challenge. So, in thinking about the coronavirus right at the very beginning, we in the federal government, and I think people across the country, were very worried about remote and northern communities. And the reality is, in particular, the premiers of the territories have magnificently risen to the challenge. They have done a fantastic job. And the same is true for Atlantic Canada. These are among the smallest parts of the country, smallest in terms of population, with the least resources, but they have actually done among best of any parts of the country in dealing with this. And that is not merely an accident of geography. That is because, people like the premiers of the territories, the premiers of Atlantic Canada, they acted very quickly, put really tough measures in place ahead of many other parts of the country and many other countries, full stop. And it's worked. And I really salute them all. And another group of Canadians who you would have thought, another group of people in our country who would have been the most vulnerable and who we still need to be concerned about, are Indigenous people in Canada. And again, there, Indigenous leadership and Indigenous leaders across the country took decisions for themselves and for their own people and their own communities ahead, again, of many other parts of the country. They took really strong, tough decisions. And again, knock on wood, so far those decisions have kept their people safe. And I think the rest of Canada should recognize that as well and really say, well done, guys.
Chrystia, before I let you go, how did you celebrate Canada Day?
I celebrated Canada Day by making many phone calls to the United States because it wasn't a holiday there. So we could still do some important calls, and we do have some important CanadaUS issues. And also by going on a bike ride with my children. And then we put on our masks and we went to the Indigo on Bay and Bloor, the first time we've been there since the coronavirus crisis. And we spent far too much money on books. And then we came home and we read our books. So that was really fun.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. It was really a pleasure speaking with you.
Great to talk to you too.
Bye for now.